Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is April 15th, 2026. And tonight's episode is all about Freemasonry, the system of light that bypasses the cross. Guys, we have a long show ahead of us. So we're going to have to just cut and get into it. We're going to skip out on all the commercials and everything, including breaking news, because this is a very, very long show. And we really need to get through this information. It's really important because Freemasonry obviously is being talked about throughout all kinds of channels, and we need to get to the bottom of it, period. That's what we do here. And, well, without further ado, let's get into it. So, Freemasonry has been called many things across history: a brotherhood, a philosophical system, a secret society, a force for good, and a hidden hand of influence. Now, for some, it represents morality, discipline, and personal growth. For others, it raises deep concerns about secrecy, spiritual ambiguity, and its place alongside established faith. Okay? The divide is not new. It has existed for centuries, shaped by both the words of its own members and the reactions of those who stand outside its doors. This examination does not begin with accusations or defense. It begins with documentation. Now, I've downloaded every book I could find on it, okay? A lot of books. Everything for Freemasonry, anti-Freemasonry, Freemasonry and Satanism, Freemasonry and other religions. And this is probably going to be the best take so far of an understanding of what Freemasonry is, judging by all of the past shows I've done on it. Now, this examination does not begin with accusation, right? And drawing directly from Masonic writings, historical records, symbolic studies over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and even critical works, this show traces Freemasonry from its origins in medieval stonemason guilds to its transformation into a symbolic and initiatory system. It explores how the tools of builders become metaphors for the inner life, how lodges become structured environments of ritual and discipline, and how the pursuit of light became the central aim of the craft. Within its own literature, Freemasonry presents itself as a system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols, designed to refine the individual through gradual understanding rather than direct declaration. But alongside that internal definition stands a long and persistent reaction. From the early political movements in America to modern theological critiques, Freemasonry has been accused of secrecy, influence, and spiritual conflict. Some have viewed it as a parallel system that operates outside the authority of established religion. Others have gone further, attributing to Freemasonry as a global control or hidden agenda. This show tonight separates these claims carefully, distinguishing between documented criticism, historical events, and exaggerated narratives that have grown over time. Now, at the center of this examination is a single question: what does Freemasonry mean when it speaks of light? And how does that compare to the light revealed in Jesus Christ? Well, Freemasonry teaches a journey toward truth through symbols, ritual, and personal progression. It allows each man to define his understanding of God while participating in a shared system of moral development. It does not claim to replace religion, yet it constructs a spiritual framework that operates independently of any single doctrine. So this creates a tension that cannot be ignored. And suddenly, and sorry, because Christianity does not present truth as something hidden to be uncovered, but as something revealed fully through the person of Jesus Christ. So this show does not rely on fear or speculation or secondhand testimony. It walks through the structure, teaching, and history of Freemasonry step by step, allowing its own source to speak for itself. It also examines the reactions against it, understanding why opposition has been so strong and why interpretations have varied so widely. In the end, the goal here is clarity, not to label prematurely, but to understand completely, not to inflame, but to test it, not to collapse complex history into simple conclusions, but to examine whether a system built on the pursuit of light, apart from the cross, ultimately aligns with truth or diverges from it. Because if the foundation is different, then the destination will be too. So there are certain subjects that carry weight the moment that they are spoken. Freemasonry is one of them. For some, the name brings curiosity. For others, suspicion, especially with me. And for many, it brings a quiet uncertainty because they've heard just enough to know it matters, but not enough to understand why. Well, that tension alone tells us something, because anything that has existed this long, influenced this many people, and produced this much disagreement cannot be dismissed with a sentence. It has to be examined. And I did. Not through rumor and not through reactions and not through fear or blind defense, but through what can actually be known. Now, Freemasonry did not begin as a mystery. It began with stone. Men who built cathedrals, structures that still stand today, organized themselves into guilds. They had standards, methods, and systems of trust. They developed ways to recognize one another, to protect their craft, and to pass down knowledge. At that stage, there is nothing spiritual hidden behind it, only labor, skill, and structure. Now, judging by all of those old buildings that everyone's talking about, the pre-mud flood buildings, right? All of the rumors of buildings that were designed to attract energy, right? Free energy, all right? Well, what it's really looking like is the Masons, they were the ones who designed these buildings, and the knowledge of them keeping how they did that close at their chest. But there's also been a lot more to it, but we'll get into that whole thing. But to basically pass down that knowledge, and at that stage, there is nothing spiritual hidden behind it, only labor, skill, and structure. But over time, something did change. Those lodges began admitting men who were not builders. They started admitting thinkers, philosophers, men of influence. The tools remained, but their meaning shifted. The square was no longer just for measuring. It became a tool of morality. And the compass was no longer just for drawing. It became a symbol of restraint. The work moved from shaping stone to shaping the man. Okay, from stone to man. And that is where Freemasonry, as we truly know it, begins. A system built not on direct instruction, but on symbols, not on declarations, but on allegory. A system that does not hand truth to you plainly, but invites you to pursue it piece by piece through ritual, through initiation, and through progression. Now, inside its own writings, Freemasonry describes itself as a system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. That means from the very beginning, it is telling you something important. What you see on the surface is not the full meaning. You are expected to look deeper, to interpret, to uncover. And that raises the first real question. If truth is veiled, who determines when it is fully revealed? Because Freemasonry does not claim to define God in a specific way. It requires belief in a supreme being, but it does not tell you who that being is beyond that general acknowledgement. It allows men of different beliefs to stand together under one structure, united not by doctrine, but by shared pursuit. Now, we're talking about the overall picture of the lodge. We're not talking about individual lodges where there have been certain individual lodges who go beyond and start instructing other black magic type of things, saying Lucifer is their one. So let's not go into that, but this is how the Satanism thing started to creep its way into it. Now, on the surface, it sounds like unity, and in many ways it is, but unity without agreement on truth creates a different kind of system. One where the individual becomes responsible for defining what is ultimately real, while still operating inside a framework that shapes how that discovery takes place. Now, that is where the second question begins to form. If each man defines truth within the system, is the system guiding them, or is he guiding himself? Well, Freemasonry teaches that light is something to be pursued, that through discipline, reflection, and progression, a man becomes more refined, more aware, more aligned with what is good and true. The language is consistent: light, growth, transformation, ascent. But when you step back and look at it carefully, you begin to see the structure. It is a path upward, not through surrender, but through development. Earn your way into heaven. It's the toll booth here. Okay? Not a free gift that Jesus gave. Not through revelation given, but through understanding gained. Not through a single moment of truth, but through stages. And that distinction matters because the gospel presents something entirely different. It does not describe truth as hidden behind layers, waiting to be uncovered. The Bible declares that truth has already been revealed, fully, not symbolically, but personally, not progressively, but completely in Jesus Christ. So now the examination begins unavoidable. Freemasonry does not present itself as an enemy of Christianity. It does not openly deny Jesus Christ. In many cases, its members may even identify as Christians, but the system itself does something subtle. It creates a parallel path, one that speaks the language of light, transformation, and morality, but does not anchor that path in the cross. And that is where the tension lives, because two systems can use similar words and mean very different things. Light in one system is something you move toward. Light in another is someone who has already come. So one system teaches that through effort, discipline, and understanding, a man becomes more complete. And the other teaches that apart from Christ, a man cannot complete himself at all. So this is not a small difference. It's a foundation of everything. And yet alongside all of this, there is another layer that cannot be ignored. Freemasonry has been accused of many things: control, secrecy, influence, and spiritual deception. And some of those claims come from historical events, and some from interpretation, and some from fear, and some come from exaggeration that has grown over time. So this examination cannot be just one-sided. It has to walk carefully. It has to look at what Freemasonry actually teaches, what it actually does, what it has historically been involved in, and also what has been said about it, but fairly and unfairly. Because if something is true, it does not need to be inflated to be seen. And if something is not true, it will not stand when tested. We know this. So the purpose of this show is not to declare guilt or innocence before the evidence is laid out. It is to understand the system as it is, historically, structurally, and spiritually, and then measure it, not against opinion, but against the truth. Because in the end, this is not just about an organization. It is about a question every person must answer, whether they enter a lodge or not. Where does light actually come from? And if the source is wrong, does the path still lead where you think it does? Well, Freemasonry does not begin in secrecy, not in the beginning. It begins in plain sight in the dust and labor of medieval construction. Long before symbols, rituals, or philosophical language were attached to it, it was a profession. Men who worked with stone, cutting, shaping, and assembling the massive structures of Europe, formed organized groups to protect their trade, to maintain standards, and ensure trust among those who handled highly skilled and specialized work. These men were not ordinary laborers. They were craftsmen responsible for building cathedrals, castles, and civic structures that acquired and required precision, mathematics, and coordination over long periods of time. Because their work demanded both skill and reliability, they developed systems to identify one another. These systems included signs, passwords, and levels of progression, not for spiritual purposes, but for practical ones. They needed to know who was trained, who could be trusted, and who belonged. Now, within these early lodges, there was already structure. There were ranks, apprentices learning the trade, journeymen advancing in skill, and masters overseeing the work. There were expectations of conduct, discipline, and loyalty. Knowledge was not given freely to anyone. It was passed down carefully, earned through time and experience. And at that stage, what we see is not a hidden society, but a controlled profession. Remember, those buildings were just amazingly worked, right? Made what looks like from machine, not man. But even here, something began to form that will later define Freemasonry. The stonemasons were not only building structures, they were working with a framework that naturally lent itself to meaning. Geometry was not only just a tool, it was a language. Order, proportion, and balance were not just technical requirements. They reflected something deeper about how the world itself was understood. The act of building required alignment, measurement, and precision, and over time, those ideas began to carry weight beyond the physical work. Still, at this point, everything remains grounded in reality. There is no evidence of a global network, no unified secret doctrine, no hidden spiritual system controlling events. What exists is a trade guild, structured, disciplined, and protective of its knowledge, but not yet philosophical in the way it would later become. The turning point comes not with the builders, but with those who were not builders. By the late 1500s and into the 1600s, changes were happening across Europe. The great age of cathedral construction was slowing. The demand for large-scale stonework was declining. And at the same time, society itself was shifting. Education, philosophy, and scientific thought were expanding, and men outside the trade began to show interest in these lodges. So for reasons that are debated and still debated to this day, these lodges began admitting members who had no backgrounds in masonry. These were not craftsmen. They were scholars, thinkers, and men of influence. They were drawn not to the labor, but to the structure, the symbolism, and the order that already existed within the guild system. So this is where the transformation of Freemasonry begins. The tools remained the same, but their meaning started to change. The square, once used to ensure accuracy in stonework, became a symbol of moral alignment. The compass, used to draw circles and measure distance, became a symbol of restraint and boundaries in life. The level, which ensured even construction, became a symbol of equality among men. And what had once been purely functional began to take on a philosophical weight. So this shift marks the movement, remember it's from the 1500s, 1600s, marks the movement from what is called operative masonry to speculative masonry. Well, operative masonry builds structures. Speculative masonry builds ideas and eventually the individual. So it went from building stone to building the inner man by chasing a light, which Jesus already gave. So inside Masonic writings, this transition is openly acknowledged. Early documents describe the original Masons as builders who followed moral codes and traditions, but by the 1600s, non-Masons were being admitted, and the purpose of the lodge began to evolve. The physical work became less central. The symbolic interpretation became more important. And by the early 1700s, this transformation was complete enough to form something new. In 1717, several lodges in London came together to form what is recognized as the First Grand Lodge. This was not the beginning of Freemasonry, but it was the beginning of its modern structure. From this point forward, Freemasonry was no longer a scattered collection of guilds. It was an organized system with governance, continuity, and the ability to expand. And expand it did. From England, it spread across Europe and into the American colonies. Lodges were established in cities, towns, and emerging nations. Membership grew, and with it came influence, not because of the central plan, but because the men involved often held positions of authority in society. Politicians, thinkers, and leaders became members, and naturally, the presence of Freemasonry began to intersect with public life. But it's important to stay grounded here, guys. At no point in the early history do we find evidence of a hidden global control structure directing events behind the scenes. What we find instead is something more subtle and in many ways more significant, a system that had transitioned from building stone to shaping thought and from shaping thought to shaping men. That is the real origin, not a secret beginning, but a visible one. Now, this is recorded in a bunch of books that I found from the 1700s on the beginnings of it, and then in the 1800s on how it progressed. So these are all books that I'm finding and I'm reporting on. And I know every time I go and do a deep dive on something, I'm always let down too, because I thought Freemasonry was just all satanic. Well, some lodges can be, and they do evil things, but the entire thing wasn't about that. And it later, got, I don't know, you could say like infiltrated by Satanists, but it still doesn't mean that the whole thing is satanic. It's just like anything in this world. Some places do bad things and some places do not. So not all lodges are evil continually. So don't freak out. So it's not a sudden creation here, not a secret beginning, but a gradual transformation of this place, of this thing, this unit, okay? Remember, first stone, then creating the man, and then it throughout history they've used it to infiltrate governments. But we'll get into that later. But a profession became a philosophy, and a guild became a brotherhood, and the work moved from the outside to the inside. Now, that shift from physical construction to symbolic meaning is the foundation for everything that follows, because once the tools are no longer just tools, but representations of something deeper, the system itself then changes. So it's no longer about what is being built in the world, it's about what is being built within the man. Okay, so by the time of the early 1700s arrived, Freemasonry had already undergone the most important transformation. It was no longer primarily a working trade of stone builders. The lodges had become places where symbolic meaning, philosophical discussion, and structured fellowship had taken root. What remained was for that evolving system to organize itself, and that moment comes in 1717. Now, in London, 4 existing lodges gathered together and formed what became known as the First Grand Lodge. 4 in London. Now, this event is not surrounded by myth in the same way that earlier origins are. It is one of the first points in Freemasonry where documentation becomes more reliable, where records begin to replace speculation. And that alone makes it critical, because from this point forward, Freemasonry moves out of the uncertain territory of legend and into the traceable history. But this thing was more than just a meeting, it was restructuring. Okay, before 1717, lodges operated independently. They had their own customs, their own rhythms, their own variations of practice. There was no unified authority, no standardized system binding them together. The formation of the Grand Lodge changed all of that. It introduced governance. It created continuity. It allowed for expansion without losing identity. So this is where Freemasonry becomes something recognizable as an institution. With the establishment of the Grand Lodge came the need for consistency. Rituals began to be shaped into more uniform forms. Degrees were more clearly defined. Language and symbolism were preserved and transmitted with greater intention. And what had once been fluid and local began to take on a structure that could be replicated across regions. Now, one of the key developments in this period was the publication of constitutions. These were formal documents outlining the principles, rules, and structure of Freemasonry. These writings attempted to do something ambitious, to give the fraternity both a historical narrative and a moral framework. They connected the evolving system back to older traditions, sometimes blending documented history with symbolic or legendary accounts. And this is where something important happens. Even as Freemasonry becomes more organized, it does not abandon ambiguity. It actually formalizes it. The constitutions and writings of the early 1700s do not present a simple linear history. They often reach backward, connecting Freemasonry to ancient builders, biblical figures, and early civilizations. Some of these connections are symbolic, some are speculative. Some are attempts to give the fraternity a sense of continuity with the past. But even within Masonic scholarship, it is acknowledged that these early narratives are not always historically verifiable. But this tells us something critical about the system being built. Freemasonry is not trying to anchor itself purely in documented history. It's building a framework that blends history, symbolism, and tradition into a unified identity. The goal is not just to explain where it comes from, but to give meaning to what it is. Now, as the Grand Lodge system took hold, Freemasonry began to spread rapidly. Remember, 4 lodges, then they started one Grand Lodge in London. Lodges were established across Europe, in Scotland, Ireland, France, and beyond. Now, from there, it crossed into the American colonies, where it took root among early civic leaders and thinkers. This expansion was not random. It followed networks of influence, men who were already connected through education, politics, or social standing. As they carried Freemasonry into new regions, they also carried its structure with them. Lodges were established with recognizable forms. Degrees were conferred in consistent ways, and symbols were preserved. And with that expansion came visibility. Freemasonry was no longer a quiet, localized practice. It was now present in cities, among leaders, and within the developing structures of society. And this visibly created 2 parallel reactions. Inside the lodges, there was a sense of order, purpose, and continuity. Okay, remember, these are brothers. Members saw themselves as part of a structured brotherhood committed to moral development and mutual support. Outside the lodges, something began to form. Questions. Why the secrecy? Why the oaths? Why the closed meetings? Why were influential men gathering in a system not fully visible to the public? These questions did not immediately turn into opposition, but they created the conditions for it. Because once an organization becomes both structured and widespread, it no longer exists in isolation. It becomes part of the social fabric, and anything not fully understood within that fabric begins to attract interpretation. Now, remember, first, it was about the building castles and all that stonework that looks like it was done by machines. Okay, back in the 1500s, they were all trying to hold on to that ancient work because in geometry, they were able to create it. I don't know how, but that kind of work was like way ahead in the future. Okay, and they're trying to hold on to all that secrecy of that work because they didn't want it to give it into other people. So they created all kinds of, secret handshakes and signs, etc. But eventually it got infiltrated by people who wanted, instead of to work with stone, to work with the inner man. Okay, I'm not saying the lodge is good. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying in the beginning, we're talking about the history of it. So these questions did not immediately turn into opposition. They created conditions for it because once an organization becomes both structured and widespread, it no longer exists in isolation. It becomes part of the social fabric, okay? But before moving into reaction, it's important to stay with what is actually happening inside the system in the 1700s. By the mid-1700s, Freemasonry had established itself as a governed structure through grand lodges, a standardized system through defined degrees and rituals, a shared identity through symbols and teachings, and a growing network spreading across nations. And yet, even with all that structure, it maintained a key characteristic that set it apart. It did not define truth in absolute terms. It required belief in a supreme being, but did not define that being. It taught morality, but did not root that morality in a single doctrine. It used biblical imagery, but did not present itself as a biblical system. It created unity, but not through agreement on theology. So this allowed it to expand across cultures and beliefs, but it also introduced a tension that would grow over time. Because a system that organizes men, shapes their thinking, and connects them across regions without defining ultimate truth will always raise a deeper question. What is the foundation holding it together? Well, by the end of this period, Freemasonry had become something entirely new compared to its origins. It was no longer a trade. It was no longer local. It was no longer unstructured. It was now a system that could grow, a system that could influence, a system that could be interpreted in different ways depending on who was looking at it. And that system, formed in structure but open in meaning, is what the rest of the examination must now begin to understand. So by the time Freemasonry becomes organized and established through grand lodges, one defining characteristic sets it apart from nearly every other system. It does not teach through direct instruction. It teaches through symbols. Now, this is not an accidental feature. It is the design. Within its own writings, Freemasonry consistently describes itself as a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. Well, that statement is not decorative language. It is a blueprint for how the entire system operates. Every ritual, every degree, every object within the lodge is part of the structured method of teaching that does not present truth plainly, but wraps it in layers that must be interpreted. Well, to understand this, the first step is to recognize what allegory actually does. An allegory is a story, image, or object that carries meaning beyond its surface. It allows multiple levels of understanding to exist at once. Well, that's not good. What one person sees may differ from what the other sees, depending on their experience, their attention, and their willingness to engage. While in Freemasonry, this is not a side effect, it is the mechanism. So the tools of the original stonemasons remain central, but they no longer function as tools. They function as symbols. The square becomes a representative of moral conduct, living in alignment with what is right. The compass becomes a representative of restraint, knowing the limits of desire and action. And the level becomes a representation of equality, reminding members that all stand on common ground regardless of status. Now, these meanings are not imposed as doctrine. They are presented as interpretations, guides rather than commands. A Mason is not told exactly what to think. He is given a structure within which to think. And this approach creates something very different from traditional teachings. In most systems, truth is declared, it is defined, explained, and transmitted clearly. The goal is to understand through clarity. While in Freemasonry, truth is approached. It's suggested, symbolized, and gradually uncovered. And the goal is understanding through discovery. So the difference is subtle at first, but it changes everything. Because when the truth is veiled, the responsibility shifts to the individual. So the system provides the framework, but the meaning must be drawn out by the one engaging with it. And this creates a sense of ownership over the insight. What is discovered feels earned, but it's not given. But it also introduces a question that cannot be avoided. So if truth is not declared, but interpreted, how is it anchored? Well, Freemasonry does not provide a single fixed answer to that question. Instead, it allows the symbols to remain open enough that different men can arrive at different understandings while still participating in the same system. Well, this flexibility is one of the reasons it has been able to span cultures, nations, and belief systems and survive for hundreds of years. It does not require uniformity of thought. It requires participation in the structure, and this is why it's lasted so long. So this is reinforced through ritual. Ritual is not simply repetition, it is controlled experience. Within the lodge, actions, words, and movements are carefully arranged to create a specific environment. The initiate is not just told something, he is placed into a sequence that is meant to be felt, observed, and internalized. The experience itself becomes part of the teaching. And once again, the meaning is not always explained, it's encountered. So, this method of teaching, symbol, allegory, ritual, creates a system that is both structured and open at the same time. Structured in its form, open in its interpretation. And the same symbols are presented to every member. But what those symbols ultimately represent can vary depending on the individual. Remember, each individual can compare a symbol in different ways, and because of that, nobody can come to one simple conclusion. They just think that somebody just must be higher up in knowledge and in understanding than the other. So that is why Freemasonry can describe itself as a moral system without defining a single universal doctrine. It promotes virtues like integrity and discipline and brotherhood and self-improvement, but it does not tie those virtues to one exclusive source of truth. It allows each member to connect those ideas to their own understanding of the divine, the world, and themselves. Now, at this point, the system is doing something very specific. It is forming the individual through indirect means. Instead of saying, this is truth, it says, this represents truth. Consider it. Oh, so instead of saying, this is the path, it says, walk this structure and discover your path. Instead of saying, this is what you must believe, it says, here is the framework, interpret it. And that approach has a certain appeal to people. It does. It respects individual thought. It avoids confrontation over doctrine. It creates unity without requiring agreement on specifics. It gives the sense that truth is something deeper than words, something that cannot be fully captured in direct statements. But it also introduces a tension that grows more visible the longer the system is examined. Because a system that veils truth does not just protect it, it obscures it. And when truth is obscured, two things begin to happen. First, it becomes possible for multiple, even conflicting interpretations to exist within the same structure. One man may see a symbol and connect it to a moral principle. Another may see the same symbol and connect it to a philosophical idea. A third may see it as something entirely different. The system holds them all because it does not force a single conclusion. So they're all right. Oh, well, all right. So second, the absence of a fixed definition means the system itself becomes the guide. The lodge, the ritual, the progression, these become the environment within which understanding is shaped, even though interpretation is individual. It is still happening within a controlled framework. So that balance, freedom of interpretation within structured experience, is what gives Freemasonry its unique character. It is not chaotic. It is not random. It is carefully constructed, but it also is not explicit. And that leads to the central question of this part. If a system teaches morality through symbols and truth through allegory without defining that truth directly, what is the final authority? Well, because eventually every system must answer that. Is truth something that is uncovered step by step through effort and reflection, or is truth something that must be revealed clearly without ambiguity so that it cannot be mistaken? Well, Freemasonry builds its answer through symbols, but symbols, by their nature, do not close the question. They just keep it open. There you have it. So, if there is one word that defines Freemasonry more than any other, it is the word light. It appears in the language and rituals, purpose and identity, and members are said to be brought to light. They are encouraged to seek more light, encouraged to progress through the system, which is often described as movement from darkness into greater illumination. It is not a minor theme, it is the center. It's where Illuminati comes from. But in order to understand Freemasonry, that word has to be examined correctly and carefully, because the meaning of light determines the meaning of everything else. Inside Masonic teaching, light is not presented as a single fixed concept. It is described in terms of knowledge, awareness, moral understanding, and personal development. It represents the process by which a man becomes more refined, more aware of himself, more aligned with what is considered good, more capable of navigating life with clarity. Well, in this sense, light is something that grows. It is not received all at once, it is pursued. It is gained through effort, reflection, and progression. Each degree, each symbol, each experience within the lodge is designed to contribute to that increase. A man does not begin with full understanding, he moves toward it. So this creates a very specific model. Light is not a destination that is handed to you. It is a path you walk. And that path is structured. The initiate begins in a state described as darkness. Not necessarily ignorance in the negative sense, but a lack of full awareness. Now, through ritual and instruction, he is gradually exposed to more meaning, more symbolism, more interpretation. Each step is intended to expand his perception. So the system reinforces this progression. You're not given everything at once. You are given enough to move forward. And that approach has a certain logic to it. In many areas of life, understanding does develop over time, and skill increases with practice. Insight deepens with experience. Well, Freemasonry takes that natural process and builds a framework around it, turning growth into a structured journey. But the deeper question is not how light is pursued, it is what light actually is. Because if the definition is not clear, the pursuit can lead in many directions. Freemasonry allows for that flexibility. It does not define light in a way that excludes different interpretations. One member may see it as a moral clarity, another may see it as a philosophical understanding. So the system accommodates all of these views as long as they fit within the general idea of growth and refinement. And this openness is part of its strength. It allows men from different backgrounds, beliefs, and traditions to participate without conflict. It avoids division by not forcing a single explanation, and it creates a shared language without demanding identical conclusions. But that same openness introduces a critical tension. Because when light is not defined, it becomes relative to the one pursuing it. And when light becomes relative, the question of authority becomes unavoidable. So who determines when a man has truly reached light? Who defines what that light ultimately is? Who defines or decides whether the path is leading in the right direction? Well, Freemasonry answers this not with a single authority, but with the process. The structure itself becomes the guide. The degrees, the symbols, the rituals, these form the environment in which the pursuit takes place. The man is not left entirely on his own, but neither is he given a final, absolute definition. He is always moving forward, always learning, always interpreting, always seeking more. But that is why the language never settles. There is always more light to be gained, and that is where the contrast begins to emerge. Because in Scripture, the Bible, light is not described in the same way. And light is not presented as something gradually uncovered through effort, meaning all of this stuff is anti-Bible. But we can't just naturally say that they're all Luciferians, even though many of them were. A lot of them were Christians too. Not hidden behind layers, but made known. Not dependent on interpretation, but declared. So the difference is not just in language, it is in the structure. One system teaches that light increases as a man ascends, and the other teaches that light has already come and a man must receive it. One system builds toward understanding through progression, the other begins with revelation and calls for a response. So Freemasonry speaks of moving from darkness into light through stages of awareness. Well, the gospel of Jesus Christ, it speaks of moving from darkness into light through a single decisive encounter with truth. So that difference cannot be reduced or softened. It sits at the core. Because if light is something you build toward, then the path becomes essential. The steps matter. The progression matters. The system matters. But if light is something that has already been revealed, then the question shifts. It is no longer about how far you have progressed. It's about whether you have received what has already been given. So can you guys kind of understand now why the lodge is so enticing to be a part of? A brotherhood, and everyone's right, and there is no truth. And if they say there is truth, you need to seek more light. And when you seek more light, the symbols of what you see and stuff are told that you're on the right path, and yet, but nobody really knows. It's like the perfect system of getting a bunch of dudes together and use that for, I don't know, corruption. Now, I'm not saying they're corrupt, but many lodges have corrupted many cities. So it's about whether you have received what has already been given. So Freemasonry does not deny the existence of truth, okay? It does not deny the idea of a higher reality, but it approaches both through a process that keeps the final definition completely open, okay? It encourages the pursuit without closing the question. And that is why language of light continues without conclusion, because there's always another level to reach. There's always another symbol to find. There's always another layer to consider. So the journey does not end in a single moment of clarity. It just continues on and on and on. But that raises the question that must now be forced directly. If the pursuit of light never resolves into a final defined truth, is the system leading to clarity or sustaining the search? Or even, delaying the search? Because those are not the same thing. One brings an end to certainty, the other ensures that it continues. And the answer to that question will determine whether the path is being followed leads to what is real or simply just keeps the seeker moving, which is why it works so well. Now, up to this point, the system has been defined by its structure, its symbols, and its pursuit of light. Are we all in agreement? Please say yes. But none of those elements operate in isolation. They are activated through something very specific: initiation. Freemasonry is not simply learned, it is entered, okay? You can't learn it, you enter into it. And that distinction matters because initiation is not just about gaining information. It is about undergoing a process that is meant to change how a person sees, thinks, and understands. It is experiential, meaning it's an experience, not just intellectual. The individual is not standing outside the system analyzing it. He is placed inside, moving through it. So from the very beginning, initiation is presented as a transition, a movement from one state into another, from what is described as darkness into light, from an unformed condition into one that is being shaped. The language is deliberate, but the meaning is not always explained directly. The initiate is guided through a sequence of actions, words, and symbols that are meant to leave an impression before they are fully understood. And this is how the system teaches, not by laying out concepts first, but by creating an experience that must later be interpreted. So within Freemasonry, the early stages are often referred to as degrees. Hey, what's up, Robert Gerdeson? So these are not casual milestones. They are structured phases of development. Each degree carries its own symbolism, its own themes, and its own lessons. But these lessons are not handed over in plain English. They are embedded within the ritual itself. Now, the first stage introduces the individual to the idea of beginning. It emphasizes entry, awareness, and the initial step towards understanding. The focus is not on mastery, but on orientation, learning how to see differently, how to engage with the system. The second stage builds on that foundation. It expands the scope of understanding, introducing broader concepts and deeper symbolism. The individual is no longer simply entering, he is progressing, moving further into the structure, engaging more actively with its meaning. The third stage brings the process to a more complete form. But even here, completion does not mean finality. It represents a transition into a different level of awareness, but the journey itself does not end. There are further systems, further degrees, further interpretations beyond this point. Now, this progression reveals something important. Freemasonry is not structured around arrival. It is structured around movement. Keep them moving, give them new symbols, keep them going. There's no real answer. There's no real truth here, okay? And this is all the stuff that they practice together to find the light, to get closer to the light, but it doesn't really at all explain what its influence is on, like institutions outside of it. So you're always becoming something more than you were before. The language of the system reinforces this constantly through growth, refinement, development, advancement. And the initiative is not static, he is being shaped. And that shaping is intentional. The rituals themselves are designed with precision. Words are spoken in specific ways. Movements are carried out in defined patterns. The environment is controlled to focus attention and create a sense of significance. Every element contributes to the experience. Now, this is not random tradition. It is a method. And the method works by engaging more than just the mind. It engages the senses, the emotions, and the perception of the individual. It places him in a position where he is not just thinking about meaning, he is encountering it. And because this meaning is not fully explained, it remains with him, prompting reflection long after the ritual is complete. Remember, there is no truth in Freemasonry. There's just symbols and searching for the light. They don't define the truth. When you go in, you ask, is this true? They'll say, go to the light. So over time, this creates a shift, right? The individual begins to think within the framework of the system. Symbols that once seemed abstract begin to carry personal significance with you because you've been working in the system and now you've got a personal attachment. The structure becomes familiar, the language becomes natural, and what once was external now becomes internal. Well, that's the transformation of Freemasonry. Not forced, not immediate, but gradual. And because it is gradual, it often goes unnoticed in the moment. There is no single point where the individual stops and says, I have changed. Instead, the change happens through accumulation, through repeated exposure, repeated interpretation, repeated participation. Now, this is why initiates and initiation matters so much within Freemasonry. It's not simply an entry point. It is the beginning of a process that continues to shape the individual as long as he remains within the system. The degrees, the rituals, the symbols, all of them work together to create an ongoing environment of formation. But again, you'll never reach a top. There is no top in Freemasonry. There is no truth in Freemasonry. Even though you think that you're going to get to the truth, you never do, because they don't have an answer for the truth. But again, the question must be asked, what is the direction of that formation? Well, Freemasonry presents it as upward. You're going up. Up, 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 up. A movement toward greater light, greater understanding, greater refinement, but you never reach it. And the language is consistent and the structure supports it, but the system itself does not define the final point of that ascent. It provides the path, but not the destination in absolute terms. That is left open. And that openness creates the possibility of uncertainty. Because a system that forms a person without defining the final truth is shaping the journey without anchoring the end. Does that make sense? The individual is moving, growing, becoming, but the ultimate measure of that growth is not fixed in one clear, unchanging standard. It's just simply interpreted. And that brings the comparison into sharper focus. Now, in Christianity, the transformation also exists, but there is change, there is growth, there is development, but the structure is different. The transformation does not begin with initiation into a system. It begins with surrender to a person, well, a God. It is not a gradual ascent toward Jesus or light, and but it is a response to light already revealed. Now, growth still follows, but it follows from something already established, not something still being uncovered. Jesus paid the atonement. It's done. He did that for you. The foundation is not built step by step. It is given freely, and everything else built on it. Well, Freemasonry reverses that order. Let me repeat that, because even though a lot of you are thinking James is changing. No, I'm just able to go through more books and find more information. And the truth is what I care about. Now, that doesn't mean that lodges haven't been used for evil. They have. There's a lot of proof to that. There's a lot of whistleblowers. But tonight's about Freemasonry and the difference between that and are you a Christian and should you join Freemasonry? Because what Freemasonry is something opposite of Christianity. It's reverse. Freemasonry reverses the order. So it builds the individual step by step, expecting understanding to emerge along the way. And that difference is not small, because if transformation begins with individuals moving upward, the focus remains on that process. But if transformation begins with truth already given, the focus shifts to a response. So Freemasonry centers its transformation in progression. The gospel centers its transformation in revelation. Both speak of change, but they do not speak of it in the same way. And as initiation continues, as the individual moves deeper into the system, that difference becomes more pronounced, because the further the path goes, the more important it becomes to know not just that you are moving, but you are actually being led. So by the time a Mason has moved through initiation and begun to engage the system more deeply, the symbols themselves begin to organize around a central narrative. And that narrative is not random. It is built around one of the most recognizable structures in Scripture, the Temple of Solomon. But with Freemasonry, the temple is no longer treated as history alone. It becomes a model, a pattern, a framework for understanding the individual. Now, the temple, as presented in Masonic teaching, is not simply something that was built in the past. It is something that is being built again, symbolically, within the life of each initiate. The stones, the tools, the measurements, the structure itself all take on new meaning. They are no longer describing a physical building. They are describing a process of formation. Now the man becomes the temple. So now they're pointing back towards the Bible, right? Because we are the temple. And this is probably how Christianity got involved into the Freemason building, because Freemasons didn't start off as Christianity. Does that make sense? They're like, we can form the man and call it Freemason. It's how it happened. I didn't do it. Don't be mad at me. These are from all the books that I've gathered. So this shift is central to how Freemasonry operates. It takes a biblical structure and reinterprets it as an allegory for personal development. The work of building becomes the work of self-improvement. The precision required in construction becomes the discipline required in life. The order of the temple becomes the order that must be established within the individual. And at the center of the symbolic system is a figure that carries significant weight within Freemasonry, Hiram Abif. Hiram Abif, that's his name, Hiram Abif. In the biblical account, Hiram is a craftsman associated with the construction of the temple. Okay, remember? King David wrote down the plans for the temple. His son, King Solomon, built it, and Hiram Abif built it. His role is defined but limited. He is part of the work, not the central figure of the story. Okay? In Freemasonry, that changes. Hiram Abif becomes a central character in a narrative that is not drawn directly from Scripture, but developed within the Masonic tradition. His story is expanded, structured, and presented as a key element of the initiation process. This isn't scriptural. It is through this narrative that themes of loyalty, integrity, loss, and restoration are explored. But again, the meaning is not handed over plainly. It is experienced. The initiate is brought into the story not as a distant observer, but as a participant. The events unfold in a way that is meant to leave an impression, to create reflection, and to prompt interpretation. The details are less important than the effect, however. The narrative becomes a vehicle for teaching, not through explanation, but through encounter. So this is consistent with everything the system has already established. Truth is not declared, it is symbolized. And understanding is not delivered, it is drawn out. Now, the true story of the temple and the figure of Hiram Abif are not presented as doctrinal truths. They are presented as allegorical frameworks through which the initiate can explore ideas about life, death, purpose, and meaning. The system does not require one fixed interpretation. It allows the individual to engage with the narrative and derive significance from it. But this is where the tension deepens, because the Temple of Solomon is not originally an abstract concept. It is part of a covenantal history. It is tied to the relationship between God and his people. It presents or represents a specific place built for a specific purpose within a defined context of worship and obedience. its meaning is anchored in that reality. Freemasonry removes that anchor. It retains the imagery, the structure, the language, but shifts the focus inward. The temple is no longer primarily about God dwelling among his people. It becomes about the individual constructing something within himself. Well, the direction changes here from God to man, from covenant to symbolism, from revelation to interpretation. Thus, it's antichrist. Now, that shift does not eliminate the value of the imagery, but it changes its function. And what once was a historical and spiritual reality becomes a tool for personal reflection. The meaning is no longer fixed. It is flexible, shaped by the individual engaged with it. The same thing applies to the figure of Hiram Abiff. Within Freemasonry, his story becomes a vehicle for exploring ideas of fidelity, sacrifice, and perseverance. It carries emotional weight. It creates a sense of depth within a system, but it is not presented as part of a larger revealed truth. It stands on its own within the symbolic framework of the lodge. And again, the system remains consistent. It provides the structure. It invites interpretation. It does not define, however, the final meaning, which is why people just keep coming to it, because they never get to the top. They never get to God, even though many think they do. Well, as soon as I get higher up. Well, for many, this creates a powerful experience. The symbolism is rich. The narrative is engaging. The process of uncovering meaning can feel personal and significant. It gives the sense that truth is being approached through layers that deeper understanding is always just beyond the surface, what gets you coming back for more. But the question remains, what happens when symbols are separated from their original source? When a structure that once pointed to God becomes a reflection of the self, does it still lead in the same direction? Because symbolism can do two things. It can point beyond itself, directing attention to something greater, or it can turn inward, becoming a mirror. Well, Freemasonry uses the temple as a symbol of what the individual is becoming. The focus is on construction, on building something within. The language supports it, the rituals reinforce it, and the narrative of Hiram Abiff gives it form. But the system does not bring that process to defined conclusions rooted in a revealed truth. It leaves the individual within the structure continuing the work. And that is where the contrast becomes very clear. In Scripture, the temple is not ultimately about human construction. It points forward. It finds fulfillment beyond itself. It is not the end. It is a sign of something greater that is coming. Well, in Freemasonry, the temple becomes the work itself. And the focus is not on fulfillment outside the system, but on continued development within it. And that difference is not immediately obvious when looking at the symbols alone. The language can sound familiar, the imagery can appear connected, but the direction has changed. One point outward beyond the individual. The other turns inward, placing the work within the individual's hands. Earn your way to glory. And as the system continues to unfold, that inward focus becomes more pronounced. Because once the temple is no longer a place where God meets man, but a process where man builds himself, the entire framework shifts. Then the question is no longer, where does God dwell? It becomes, what am I becoming? And the answer to that question within Freemasonry is never fully closed or even disclosed. It's always under construction. So as Freemasonry builds its system through symbols, initiation, and the pursuit of light, it establishes one requirement that appears to anchor everything: belief in a supreme being. Now, at first, this seems like a point of clarity. Freemasonry is not aesthetic or atheistic. It does not deny the existence of God. In fact, it requires that a man acknowledge a higher power before he can enter. Now, this requirement is often presented as a safeguard, a way of ensuring that the system remains grounded in something beyond the individual. But when examined more closely, that requirement raises a deeper question. What is meant by supreme being? Well, Freemasonry intentionally does not define it. Within the lodge, God is often referred to using general language terms like great architect of the universe. Well, this title carries meaning, but it avoids specificity. I hate that word. It does not point to one particular religious tradition. It does not define the nature of God in detail, and it does not establish a single doctrine that all members must agree on. Instead, it creates a shared space where different beliefs can coexist. Now, a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, and others can stand together within the same lodge, each holding their own understanding of God, while participating in the same system. The structure does not require them to resolve those differences. It allows them to remain. And this is one of the reasons Freemasonry has been able to spread so widely, because it does not demand theological agreement. It demands acknowledgement. And that distinction is critical, because acknowledgement, without definition, creates a form of unity. But it is a unity built on what is not said as much as what is said, or what it is. And the system avoids the divisions that come from doctrine by stepping around doctrine altogether. It focuses on shared values, morality, discipline, brotherhood, while leaving the deeper questions of truth to the individual. Now, inside the lodge, this approach is reinforced. Discussion of specific religious doctrine is often avoided. The goal is to maintain harmony but by not engaging in debates over belief, and the system preserves unity among its members. The emphasis remains on the shared experience, the shared symbols, and the shared pursuit of light, which you'll never find the end of it. So this creates a unique environment. Men from different backgrounds can work together without conflict over theology. The structure holds them together, even though their beliefs may differ significantly outside of it. But this is where the tension becomes unavoidable, because if a system brings men together around a general belief in God without defining who God is, it creates a spiritual framework that operates independently of any single revealed truth. It does not deny truth, but it does not establish it either. Instead, it places the responsibility for defining truth on the individual. It is a hard word, Robert. So each man enters with his own understanding. Each man interprets the symbols through that understanding. So each man pursues light according to his own framework while still participating in the same system. But on the surface, this appears to respect personal belief, but at a deeper level, it shifts the center, because truth is no longer something that stands above the system, clearly defined and unchanging. It becomes something that exists within the system, interpreted by those who participate in it. Can you guys see how that could lead to problems with any lodge? Nobody can define what the truth is. It's, to me, it's dangerous. Okay, but many don't see it. But in my opinion, that's dangerous. I wouldn't join a lodge. That's all I'm saying. Now, truth is no longer something that stands above the system, clearly defined and unchanging. It becomes something that exists within the system, interpreted by those who participate in it. And that changes the nature of authority, because if no single doctrine is established, then no single authority over truth is recognized within the structure. The lodge becomes a place where multiple understandings can exist side by side without one being declared final. That is the design. It allows for unity without agreement. It allows for participation without conformity. It allows for spiritual language without theological definition. But again, the question must be asked, what holds that unity together? Well, if the members do not agree of the nature of God, if they do not share a defined understanding of truth, what is the foundation of the system? Well, the answer is the structure itself. The rituals, the symbolism, the progression, the shared experience. These become the common ground. The system provides the framework within which different beliefs can operate. It does not resolve those differences, it contains them. And this is where the contrast with Christianity becomes clear. Christianity does not build unity by avoiding doctrine. It builds unity through a specific declaration. There is one God, defined. There is one mediator, identified. There is one truth, revealed. Unity is not maintained by stepping around these points. In fact, even Paul said, hey, don't hang out with the non-believers, did he not? He said, have nothing to do with them. But this is like, bring everybody together. Unity, unity, unity. which can, and then when everyone comes together and nobody knows what the truth is, wouldn't it be easy? It's just me to manipulate all those people if you're the head of that lodge. I'm just saying. So Freemasonry takes an entirely different approach than Christianity. It creates a space where men can stand together without resolving questions. And it emphasizes shared pursuit over the shared conclusion. It values harmony over definition. So, yeah, this is the perfect gateway for control, but that's just me. And that approach has real effects. It allows for broad inclusion. It reduces conflict within the system. It creates a sense of brotherhood that is not limited by doctrine. But it also means that the system itself does not point to a single defined truth. It points to a process where each man moves forward according to his own understanding within a shared structure that does not require him to settle the deeper questions. And that brings the examination to a critical point. Because a system that speaks about God, that uses spiritual language, that shapes how men think about morality and truth, but does not define the nature of that truth, creates a unique kind of environment. It's not secular, but is not doctrinal. It exists in between, and in that space, something subtle happens. Subtle. The system becomes the common ground rather than the truth itself. Everyone just starts believing in their brothers. And the brotherhood becomes a point of unity rather than the agreement on who God is. So the pursuit continues, but the conclusion remains open. And that raises the question that cannot be avoided as the system unfolds further. If a man is formed within a structure that speaks about God without defining him, is he being led toward truth or being trained to navigate without ever fully arriving at it? So up to this point, Freemasonry has been examined through its ideas, its symbols, its light, its initiation, and belief. But those ideas do not exist in isolation. They are carried and reinforced through something very specific, a structure. Freemasonry is not loose. It's not casual. It's not an open-ended discussion group where anything goes. It's just simply ordered. And from the moment a man enters a lodge, he enters a controlled environment. The room itself is arranged with intention. Positions are fixed. Roles are defined. Movements are regulated. Even the direction a person walks, stands, or speaks can follow a prescribed pattern. Now, this is not incidental tradition. It is part of the system's design. The lodge is a setting where behavior is shaped through repetition. There are officers, each with specific responsibilities. There is a hierarchy that governs how authority flows within the lodge. There are procedures for opening and closing meetings, for admitting members. There are conducting rituals, and these procedures are not suggestions. They are expected to be followed with precision. So this level of detail might seem excessive from the outside, but it serves a purpose. It creates consistency. And when the same actions are repeated in the same way, they begin to carry weight. The individual no longer sees them as isolated movements, but as a part of a larger pattern. Over time, that pattern becomes familiar, and familiarity reinforces the system itself. This is how the Army does their training on recruits. Repetitiveness, over and over and over and over and over, to train and condition them in so that they can go kill. Well, it's just initiation. Train and bring people into Freemasonry and, control cities. Because some lodges do, believe it or not. But this is how the structure shapes perception. A man does not simply think differently, he begins to operate differently. And the way he carries himself, the way he responds within the lodge, the way he interacts with others is influenced by the environment he repeatedly enters. And that environment is disciplined. Freemasonry places emphasis on order. Meetings are conducted with formality. Timing matters. Roles are respected. There is an expectation of composure, of attentiveness, of participation within the framework provided. Even dress can be regulated, reinforcing the idea that the lodge is not an ordinary space. This is not just about appearance. It's about creating separation. The lodge becomes becomes distinct from everyday life. When a man steps into it, he steps into a different environment, one governed by its own rules, its own rhythm, and its own expectations. That separation increases the impact of what happens inside. It signals that what takes place there is meant to be taken seriously. We don't do that at our own churches, though, do we? We really don't rever God in that way. We just kind of come as you are, pay your tithes, and get out. Yeah, I'm saying the Freemason Lodge respects their own God more than Christians do. And within that structure, the rituals are carried out. Oh, what I meant by that is, hey, us Christians need to get off our ass and start, becoming Christians, getting closer to God. Stop stealing, killing, and destroying. Ritual in Freemasonry is not spontaneous. It is precise. Words are spoken in specific ways. Sequences are followed carefully. Yeah, they could be spells, casting spells. I don't know. I haven't read them. But sequences are followed carefully, and the repetition is intentional. It ensures that the experience remains consistent across time and space. And this consistency is what allows the system to reproduce itself. Now, a lodge in one location can operate in the same fundamental way as a lodge in another. The structure holds, the symbols remain recognizable, and the process continues without losing its identity. But beyond consistency, there is another effect. Structure reinforces authority. Not necessarily authority in the sense of a single leader controlling everything, but authority in the sense of a system itself guiding behavior. The individual submits, in a practical sense, to the order of the lodge in following its instructions to a T. He follows its procedures, he respects its hierarchy, he operates within its boundaries. And through that submission, something happens. The system becomes internalized. At first, the structure may feel external, something to be followed because it is required. But over time, as the individual participates repeatedly, the structure becomes familiar. It no longer feels imposed, it feels natural. And that is how discipline works, not by force, but by repetition. And when discipline becomes internal, it begins to influence how a person thinks beyond the immediate setting. The habits formed within the lodge can carry into everyday life. The emphasis on order, precision, and structure can shape how the individual approaches other areas of the world. And this is part of what Freemasonry aims to accomplish, not just to provide ideas, but to create an environment where those ideas are reinforced through action. But again, the question must be asked, what is the foundation of that structure? Because structure by itself is neutral. It can be used to reinforce truth, or it can be used to reinforce something that only appears to be true. So the power of structure lies in the ability to make something feel stable, consistent, and reliable. And when a system is orderly, repeated, and disciplined, it gains credibility in the eyes of those within it. But credibility is not the same as truth. Freemasonry's structure is effective. It creates unity, consistency, and a sense of purpose. It allows men from different backgrounds to function within a shared environment. It reinforces the system's teaching without needing constant explanation. But the structure does not define the truth. It is reinforcing. It supports the process. It stabilizes the experience. It maintains the system. And that leads to the deeper question. If a man is shaped by a system that is orderly, disciplined, and consistent, but that system does not clearly define ultimate truth, is the structure guiding him towards something real, or simply making the system itself feel real? Because the stronger the structure, the more convincing it becomes. The repetition, the order, the discipline, all of it builds a sense of reliability. But reliability in process does not guarantee accuracy in direction. And that distinction becomes more important as the system's influence extends beyond the lodge. Because what happens inside does not stay contained. It shapes how men think, how they interact, and how they carry those patterns into the world around them. The structure builds the man, but the question remains, what is the man being built into? So by this point, Freemasonry has revealed itself as more than just a set of ideas. It is a structured system that shapes individuals through symbols, initiation, and disciplined practice. But the system does not remain contained within the lodge. It moves outward. Because once men are formed within a structured environment, they do not leave that formation behind when they step back into society. They carry it with them. into their professions, their communities, and their positions of influence. And this is where Freemasonry begins to intersect with the visible world in ways that are often misunderstood. The influence of Freemasonry is not best understood as a hidden hand directing events from behind the scenes. It is better understood as a network of men who share a common framework operating within the structures of society, and that distinction matters. Historically, Freemasonry has been present in key moments of social development. In Europe, it existed alongside the rise of Enlightenment thinking, where ideas about reason, individual development, and civic responsibility were gaining traction. Lodges became places where men could gather, discuss ideas, and engage in structured dialogue outside of traditional institutions. Well, in the American colonies and early United States, Freemasonry found a place among civic leaders. Men involved in politics, governance, and public life were often members. This has not meant that Freemasonry itself governed the nation, but it did mean that individuals shaped by its system were participating in the formation of society. By the way, has anyone hit the like button yet? Yeah, no, none. Thanks, Boots. Guys, do me a favor. Go take your thumb. Thank you. There's 8 likes now. Thank you very much. There's 8 people here. Wow. I didn't think anybody'd show up tonight. This is quite the boring episode. So that influence extends beyond politics. Freemasonry has been involved in charitable offers, educational initiatives, and community building. Lodges often functioned as centers of mutual support where members could assist one another in times of need. This aspect of the system is well documented and cannot be ignored. It shows that Freemasonry has contributed to tangible outcomes that have benefited individuals and communities. And one of the most revealing areas of its social role comes through its history in marginalized communities. In the United States, Black Freemasonry, particularly through Prince Hall lodges, developed as a response to exclusion from white lodges. These lodges became more than fraternal organizations. They became spaces for community organization, education, and advancement during periods when broader society imposed severe limitations. Within those lodges, members supported one another, promoted education, and engaged in efforts connected to abolition and civil rights. In this context, Freemasonry functioned as a structure that provided opportunity where little existed elsewhere. And this adds an important layer to our examination. Freemasonry is not a single uniform force with one expression. Its impact has varied depending on time, place, and the people involved. In some cases, it has reflected the inequalities of the society around it. In other cases, it has provided a framework for addressing those inequalities. So this complexity is often lost in simplified narratives. Yes, they did help support people who were segregated. And because according to Freemasonry, remember, they don't see anything as truth. It's go find more of yourself within the truth to find the truth, but they also don't point to Jesus Christ. However, the charitable events and all the stuff that they've done, which there is evidence of, well, this is why many people still support Freemasonry. Seriously. Okay. So this complexity is often lost in simplified narratives. On one side, Freemasonry is portrayed as a purely benevolent organization focused on charity, brotherhood, and moral development. On the other side, it's portrayed as a hidden network of control operating behind governments and institutions. Baby eaters and blood drinkers. Well, the documented reality, I'm just talking about books from the 1700s all the way up until now. I'm not talking about whistleblowers and everybody who is against Freemasonry. I'm just talking about all the books that I went through. On the other side, it's portrayed as hidden. Okay, so the documented reality sits somewhere in between. Okay. Freemasonry has influence, but that influence is carried through people, not through centralized command structure. It has presence in positions of authority, but that presence does not automatically equate to coordinated control. It has contributed to social developments, but it also has reflected the limitations and divisions of the societies in which it operates. So understanding this requires separating influence from conspiracy. Okay, what I'm saying is, yes, they They have helped people. They've been good. And they've also, not all of them, but also some of them did some evil and screwed with a bunch of people. Now, influence occurs when individuals shaped by a system participate in society and bring that system's framework with them. Conspiracy implies coordinated, hidden control with unified intent. The historical record supports the existence of influence, but it does not consistently support the broader claims of global orchestration often attributed to Freemasonry. Sorry, but if you were going to have to write a report on it and you were going to be graded on the truth, I'm telling you. So that does not mean the influence is insignificant, right? When men share a common structure of thought formed through symbols, discipline, and shared pursuit, they often approach decisions in similar ways. And they may prioritize certain values, interpret situations through similar frameworks, and respond to challenges with a shared mindset. And that is how systems extend beyond their immediate environment. Now, not by direct command, but by shaping the individuals who act within the world. And this is where the impact becomes more subtle. Freemasonry does not need to control institutions to influence them. If enough individuals within those institutions operate from a similar framework, the influence becomes visible in patterns. How decisions are approached, how relationships are formed, how authority is understood. Now, this is not unique to Freemasonry. It is true of any system that shapes people deeply enough. But in the case of Freemasonry, the combination of symbolic formation, structured discipline, shared language, and networked relationships, well, they create a system that naturally extends beyond its formal boundaries. And that extension is what often leads to suspicion. Now, because from the outside, it can appear coordinated even when it is not formally directed. Patterns emerge, connections are noticed, and questions arise about whether those connections represent something more organized than they appear. Now, historically, those questions have led to periods of intense reaction. But before moving into that reaction, it's important to stay grounded in what can be observed. Freemasonry has existed alongside major social developments, included individuals in positions of influence, contributed to community building efforts, provided structure and support within various groups, and at the same time, it has reflected societal divisions, including racial segregation, maintained internal boundaries through its structure, and operated in ways that are not fully visible to those outside the lodge. So this combination, visible influence and limited transparency, is what creates tension. Because when an organization is both present in society and partially hidden in its operations, it invites interpretation. And some of those interpretations will be grounded in fact. Others will extend beyond what can be proven, like they're a bunch of baby eaters. And that is where the next part of the examination must go. You know, when I say this, they're all baby eaters and blood, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get everybody out of the mindset, the mindset of pointing towards one group of people that's running the world eating babies. That's not the truth. There are multiple groups of people all around the world trying to control the world. And it's not just one set of families that are satanic at the core. Some are, but it's not a full picture of what you think. Or at least what I think, or used to think. I used to think that all of them, every day, they would come home with their briefcases full of dough, slap it down, then go down into their ritual chambers and say, and then all their satanic stuff happens, and they get all their blessings, and then they eat their babies, and then they go back to doing what they do. No. It's all over the place. It's chaotic. The world it's not structured that way. It's not, okay? Now, some places there are people who do exactly that. That's their thing. But it's not just one group that you can point to. It's not how the world has worked. And the truth is in the Bible, because things change all the time. Okay? Kingdoms rise and fall, but they all don't follow the same form of religion or same form of ways. Everyone, if you guys understand, everyone, they're opinionated, they're different. And when they jump into a religion that someone else taught them or that they learned through, they're going to do it differently than anybody else. So don't lump all of it into the Khazars, the Persian, Illuminati Jews of Europe. That's simply not the truth. Now, doesn't mean there isn't one, sure. And it doesn't mean that they're not controlling Israel, maybe. But we have to have proof. We have to have evidence. We have to have the documentation that they put together to make it happen. Now, doesn't mean they don't meet secretly and do all this crap, sure. But we have got to ground ourselves in the truth. And this is something that Freemasonry won't do. That's not what it does. It does not tell you what truth is. And this is what makes it highly dangerous. But those who join it are happy with it. Those who join it don't see all of this satanic stuff, okay? And this is why they defend it, because they found a brotherhood in something that kept them probably off of drugs or off of drinking or off of something, some moral high ground they were introduced to. But it also, in my opinion, they're not Christian. Now, because the reactions of Freemasonry, whether political, religious, and cultural, did not emerge without cause, but they also did not always remain within the bounds of what could be verified. Oh, and I remember I told you guys, we're going a little over tonight. Okay, this is a huge and important show, and we didn't even start it with commercials or anything. We had to just get right into it because it's very long. Okay, so to understand Freemasonry fully, it is not enough to examine what it is. It is necessary to examine what people believe it to be and why those beliefs become strong enough to shape entire movements. Because sometimes the reaction to a system reveals as much about it as the system itself. So by the time Freemasonry had spread across Europe and taken root in America, it had already become something visible, structured, and influential. But with that visibility came something just as powerful: reaction. Freemasonry did not grow in a vacuum. As it expanded, questions followed. And those questions over time became suspicion. Suspicion, when left unresolved, became accusation. And in certain moments in history, those accusations turned into organized opposition. So the most significant early example of this is in America centers around one name, this guy named William Morgan. Now, Morgan was not a political figure, nor was he a national leader. He was a man who claimed to have knowledge of Masonic rituals and intended to publish them. In the 1820s, he disappeared under circumstances that immediately raised alarm. This happens all the time. Whistleblower coming out. You know what I mean? Whistleblower, I'm coming out and I'm going to blow the whistle, and then all of a sudden they're dead. Okay. I'm not saying that it's not behind, guys. All I'm talking about is recorded information that we can get to the truth. I don't know what goes on behind the scenes where they don't log it and they don't timestamp it. Okay. So he disappeared under circumstances immediately raised alarms, and his disappearance was widely believed by many to be connected to Freemasonry, though the full truth has never been definitively established. How convenient. But in history, perception often matters as much as proof. Morgan's disappearance ignited something far larger than the event itself. It created a wave of public outrage. Newspapers covered the story extensively. Communities began to question the secrecy of the lodges. The idea that a man could vanish after attempting to expose Masonic practices fueled a growing fear that the organization was capable of protecting itself at any cost. Rightly so. And that moment did not stay isolated. It became a catalyst. So from the catalyst emerged one of the first political movements in American history built around opposition to a single organization, the anti-Masonic movement. Now, this was not a fringe reaction. It gained enough traction to form a political party. influence elections, and shape public discourse for a period of time. Well, where in the hell is that now? Yes, this was in America, folks. There was an anti-Masonic coalition, and they shaped votes. They shaped votes by influencing the elections. No, they didn't cheat. Well, who knows? But this tells us something very important. Okay, the reaction to Freemasonry was not minor. It was strong enough to organize, to mobilize, and to enter the political arena. But to understand that reaction, it has to be examined carefully because not all of it was rooted in the same source. Some of the citizenship or criticism focused on secrecy, the idea that an organization operated with private rituals, private oaths, and internal structures not visible to the public created discomfort, obviously. And in a society that valued transparency, especially in governance, this raised concerns about what might be happening behind closed doors. Now, some of the criticism focused on loyalty. Critics questioned whether members of Freemasonry might prioritize their obligations to the lodge over their obligations to the law, their country, and their faith. And the presence of oaths and structured allegiance within the system contributed to this concern. Some of the criticisms was religious. Certain groups viewed Freemasonry as incompatible with established doctrine, particularly because of its approach to God and its avoidance of defining truth. The idea of a system that allowed multiple interpretations of the divine raised concerns about relativism and the dilution of specific beliefs. And then there were the more extreme claims. Over time, accusations expanded beyond what could be documented. Freemasonry was linked to hidden control of governments, to secret manipulation of global events, to spiritual deception on a large scale. And these claims did not emerge all at once. They developed gradually, building on earlier suspicions and expanding through interpretation and repetition. Now, this is where the reaction becomes layered. And at its core, remember when we find layers in something, it's evil. But this is where the reaction becomes layered. And at its core, there are legitimate questions. Why the secrecy? Why the oaths? Why the closed structures? Okay, these questions are grounded in observable features of the system. But as those questions moved through public discourse, they were not always handled carefully. And in many cases, they were amplified, extended, and combined with broader fears about power and control. What began as concern about a specific organization became part of a larger narrative about hidden influence. That process is not unique to Freemasonry. Any organization that is both structured and partially hidden will attract speculation. And the less information is available, the more room there is for interpretation. And once interpretation begins, it can move in multiple directions, some grounded, some exaggerated, but this is why anti-Masonic movement itself must be understood in context. It was not purely irrational. It responded to real events, real concerns, real questions, but it also existed in a period of social tension, political competition, and cultural change. Those factors shaped how the reaction developed. The movement eventually declined, the political priorities shifted, and the public focus moved elsewhere. Freemasonry, however, continued to exist, adapting to new environments and maintaining its structure. But the reaction did not disappear. It changed form. In later years, particularly in modern times, the accusations against Freemasonry have often taken on a different tone. With the rise of mass communication, the internet, global connectivity, claims about hidden control and coordinated influence have spread more widely and more rapidly. Some of these claims are based on connections, shared memberships among influential individuals, symbolic imagery appearing in public spaces, historical overlaps between Freemasonry and major events. Others go even further, attributing to Freemasonry a level of centralized control that is not consistently supported by documented evidence. This creates a situation where two extremes often dominate the conversation. On one side, Freemasonry is dismissed entirely as harmless, a simple fraternity with no deeper significance. But on the other side, it's portrayed as an all-encompassing system of control responsible for shaping global events behind the scenes. Both of these positions still miss something. Freemasonry is neither fully transparent nor fully hidden. It is neither entirely about influence nor clearly orchestrating global control. It exists in a space where structure, symbolism, and networked relations intersect with public life in ways that are not always immediately clear. Now, that complexity is what fuels ongoing reaction because people tend to seek clear answers, either complete trust or complete rejection. But systems like Freemasonry do not fit easily into these categories. They require careful examination, separating what can be documented from what has been assumed. This is where the importance of method comes clear. If the examination relies on fear, it will exaggerate. If it relies on dismissal, it will be overlooked. But if it relies on evidence, it can begin to distinguish itself between what is known, what is claimed, what's possible, and what's unproven. And that distinction is necessary because the reaction to Freemasonry, whether political, religious, or cultural, has become part of its identity. It is not just defined by what it is, but by what people believe it to be. And those beliefs have power. They shape perception. They influence discussion. They determine how the system is approached. So the question moving forward is not just what is Freemasonry, but also why has it been interpreted in such different ways? Because understanding that divide is key to understanding the system itself. And that is where the final part of this examination must go. Into the competing interpretations that have shaped Freemasonry's place in the world. Now, by now, the structure, history, teaching, and reactions surrounding Freemasonry have all been laid out. But one question still remains unresolved. And it is the question that explains everything else. Why does Freemasonry produce such radically different conclusions? Well, some look at it and see a structured brotherhood focused on morality, discipline, and community. Others look at it and see secrecy, influence, and potential danger. Some dismiss it entirely. Others assign it to enormous hidden power. And these conclusions do not come from nowhere. They come from people observing different parts of the same system, often mistaking those parts for the whole. To understand this clearly, Freemasonry has to be seen in layers. The first layer is historical reality. Freemasonry began as a guild system of operative stonemasons and transitioned into a speculative fraternity in the 1600s and 1700s. This is the most grounded layer. It is supported by documentation, by records, by the development of lodges and grand lodges. Anyone studying this level will see a clear progression from trade to philosophy. If someone stops there, their conclusions will be simple. Freemasonry is a historical fraternity that evolved over time. And at this level, that conclusion is accurate. But it's not complete. The second layer is the philosophical system. Freemasonry is not just a historical artifact, it is an active system of symbolic teaching. It uses allegory, ritual, and structured progression to shape how individuals think about morality, truth, and self-development. It does not define doctrine, but it does create a framework within which meaning is interpreted. So if someone focuses on this layer, their conclusion shifts. Freemasonry is a symbolic system designed to refine the individual. But again, this is accurate, but it's still not complete. The third layer is social influence. Freemasonry has existed within society for centuries, and its members have included individuals in positions of authority, leadership, and influence. The system creates networks, relationships that extend beyond the lodge into public life. This does not automatically imply coordinated control, but it does mean that Freemasonry has had a presence within important social structures. If someone focuses on this layer, their conclusion becomes more cautious. Freemasonry is a network of influential individuals connected by a shared system. This, too, is grounded in observable reality. But again, it's only one part. The fourth layer is the perceived hidden system. This is where interpretation moves beyond documentation. Here, Freemasonry is viewed as a centralized force controlling events behind the scenes, governments, institutions, even global systems. These conclusions are often built by connecting patterns, symbols, and relationships, then extending those connections into broader claims. Some of these observations begin with real details, shared memberships, symbolic imagery, historical overlaps, but the conclusions drawn from them often go beyond what can be consistently verified. If someone focuses primarily on this layer, their conclusion becomes definitive. Freemasonry is a hidden system of control operating behind visible structures. Well, this is the most controversial interpretation. And it is also the least consistently supported by direct evidence. Yeah, I know we don't have the evidence. Isn't that important to you guys? The truth, evidence. I'm telling you, we've been played. The Bible tells us evidence, truth. And we've been just throwing shit out there without any evidence to stick and just assuming because, hey, that sounds right. Well, that's got to change. Evidence. And it's the least consistent supported, but it persists. And the reason it persists is important because each of these layers, the 4 layers I gave you about Freemasonry, they contain something real. There's a historical layer, a philosophical system, a social influence. And when those realities are combined with limited transparency, symbolic language, and structured networks, they create a system that is open to interpretation. And when interpretation fills the gaps, it often expands. And that is how the divide forms. Okay, I'm not saying Freemasonry isn't evil. I'm saying that not all Freemasonry is evil. It didn't start off with evil intent. Many lodges probably got infiltrated with evil and they used it for evil, but it's not all together as a whole via the documentation that they have evil. One group looks at the documented history and sees a fraternity. Another looks at the symbolism and sees spiritual system, okay? Another looks at the network and sees influence. And another connects all of these and just sees control. Well, each group is responding to something that exists, yes, but not all are responding to the same layer. And this is why discussions about Freemasonry often break down. People are not actually disagreeing about the same thing. They are drawing conclusions from different levels of the system without recognizing that those levels are distinct. And once those conclusions are formed, they tend to reinforce themselves. And this is why Freemasonry hasn't gone anywhere. If someone believes Freemasonry is harmless, they will interpret its secrecy as tradition. If someone believes it's dangerous, they will interpret the same secrecy as concealment. And the same evidence is viewed through different frameworks, producing different outcomes. So this is not unique to Freemasonry. It is how human perception works. But in this case, the structure of Freemasonry amplifies it because the system itself is symbolic rather than explicit, structured but not fully transparent, influential through individuals rather than central command, and open in interpretation rather than fixed in doctrine. Well, these characteristics create space. And where there is space, interpretation must enter. So the goal here is not to collapse all interpretations into one extreme or the other. Okay? That's all I'm saying. Yeah, I know, dude. Before doing this, man, I was like, the Freemasons are a bunch of Satanists. Well, some of them are, but not all of them. And it's a perfect place for Satan to go in and muck it all up and use it for control. It's perfect for that. As long as the lodge owner, even though I don't think they have a lodge owner, but anyone could go in there and create all kinds of things and then, this is the world. This is one thing. Freemasonry isn't the heart of all corruption in the world. I used to think that it was. Well, it could have at one time, had control over Europe or even over America, maybe at one time. But it never holds because God doesn't allow the New World Order. So we're not trying to collapse all interpretations into one extreme or the other. It's to separate what can be known from what has been assumed. Now, Freemasonry it's not just one thing. It is a documented historical system, a symbolic philosophical framework, a network of relationship within societies, and a subject of ongoing interpretation and speculation. But understanding all 4 layers does not remove every question, right? But it does remove confusion. It allows the system to be seen as it is, rather than a projection of fear or dismissal. We don't need to fear Freemasonry. That's what I'm saying. We don't need to fear it. I don't think it has the power that it once had when anti-Freemasonry in America came up to defeat it. Maybe it did at one time. It can be used, but times change. And the internet is, dude, AI is going to replace all this shit. Okay. So there's going to be, man, we're going to be doing shows on Freemason, AI Freemasonry. I don't know. But it does allow the system to be seen as it is, rather than a projection of fear or dismissal. And once that clarity is established, the final step becomes possible, because after understanding what Freemasonry is, how it functions, and why it is interpreted differently, the question is no longer about layers. It becomes about alignment. Not about Freemasonry claims, not about what critics claim, but whether the system at its core aligns with truth. And that is where the examination must end, not with interpretation, but with the comparison. Because once everything is laid out clearly, the question is no longer complicated. It is direct. Where does the light actually come from? Okay. Albert Pike quoted in his thing, Morals and Dogma. He was just a member, dude. He wasn't the leader of all lodges. Okay. He wasn't the head honcho. He was just one dude out of all of it. And yes, a lot of them worship that guy, and they all say he wasn't a Satanist. And yes, in his book Morals and Dogma, he quoted Lucifer as an inspiration. But where does the light actually come from? It's not coming from Jesus. That's all I'm saying. I'm saying they're not Christian. They're not Muslim. They're not Hindu. They're nothing other than a clever way to get a bunch of people together to work on nothing. They think they're improving, but they're not. So after everything that has been examined, history, structure, symbolism, initiation, influence, and reaction, the final question is not complicated. It's focused. What is the source of the light? Because everything in Freemasonry points toward that pursuit. Every degree, every symbol, every ritual reinforcing the idea that a man moves from darkness into light through a process. He learns, he grows, he refines himself, and through that progression, he becomes something more than what he was before. Well, that is the system. Light is approached. Truth is uncovered. Transformation is achieved through disciplined movement forward. And within that structure, the individual is always in motion, always learning, always interpreting, always advancing. And the path itself becomes central. But when that model is placed next to Scripture, the difference becomes impossible to ignore, because Scripture does not describe light as something hidden behind layers, waiting to be uncovered through effort. It describes light as something that has already come into the world, not symbolically, personally, not progressively, completely. And the distinction is not about language, it's about foundation. Freemasonry teaches that a man moves toward light. The gospel teaches that light light has come to the man. Freemasonry builds a path of ascent. The gospel reveals a truth that must be received. Freemasonry forms the individual step by step, expecting understanding to emerge along the way. The gospel begins with understanding already given and calls the individual to respond to it. This is not a minor difference in method. It is a complete difference in direction, because when light is something to be reached, the responsibility rests on the individual to continue moving. The process becomes essential. The structure becomes necessary. The system becomes the environment in which that movement takes place. But when light is something that has already been revealed, well, the process changes. So the question is no longer how far a man can progress. It is whether he will receive what has already been given. And that changes everything. Freemasonry speaks of transformation through discipline, refinement, and self-development. It presents a model where a man becomes better through effort, through understanding, through alignment, and with symbolic principles he encounters. The gospel speaks of transformation as something that begins with surrender, not a refinement of the self moving upward, but the recognition that the self cannot complete itself. Freemasonry encourages the individual to build, to shape, to construct, to improve what is within. Let's just call it what it is. It's a fucking gym, all right? It's a gym membership to make yourself better, to make you look better, okay? Why do you need muscles? Who are you trying to impress? Well, muscles, dude, muscles, getting in shape like that to look hot, you're doing it for yourself. And same with people joining Freemasonry. They're doing it for themselves. They're doing it for self-gain, okay? They're not surrendering to God, giving it all to Jesus, period. The gospel declares that the foundation has already been laid and that apart from that foundation, no structure will stand. These two approaches can appear similar on the surface. Both speak of growth, both speak of becoming something more, both speak of moving away from darkness, but they do not begin in the same place, and they do not lead to the same conclusion. One places the starting point within the individual, and the other places the starting point outside the individual. One relies on progression, the other on revelation. And that is where the conflict becomes clear, because Freemasonry does not present itself as an enemy of Christianity. It does not require a man to reject his faith. It allows him to bring his beliefs into the system, but it places those beliefs within a framework that does not affirm them as final. They become part of the individual's interpretation. They exist alongside other interpretations. They're not established as a singular defining truth within the system, and because of that, the system itself operates independently of the cross, period. It uses language that can sound familiar, like light and truth and transformation. Well, so did Alice Bailey. She was full of shit. Same with Helena Blavatsky. She was full of shit. And Aleister Crowley, same shit. But it does not anchor these concepts in the person of Jesus Christ as the sole source. It creates a parallel path. Robert Gerson's like, I'm at the gym. I'm going home now. But wasn't that good, though? Wasn't that a good thing? It's a fucking gym, man. Freemasonry is a gym. It's a membership where everyone can get together and try to improve themselves to look hot, to look better in front of society. And yeah, they'll help them out. They'll do it. A path where a man can pursue understanding, pursue growth, pursue light without ever being required to confront the necessity of Christ as the foundation of that light. That is the conflict. Not secrecy, not symbols, not structure, just a source. So where does light actually come from? If it comes from within through effort, discipline, and progression, then the system holds. But if light comes from outside, revealed fully and completely in Jesus Christ, then any system that builds toward light without that foundation is moving in a different direction. And that is the point where the examination must become personal. Because this is no longer about Freemasonry as an organization. It's about a path a person chooses to follow. Is truth something that must be uncovered over time through effort and interpretation? Or is truth something that has already been revealed and must be received as it is? Doesn't the Bible say that the Holy Ghost is the truth teller and the comforter? What are you going to a gym for, like the Freemasonry? What are you trying to get? All your questions can be answered by the Holy Ghost. Freemasonry leaves that question open. The gospel does not. And that is why the two cannot be treated as the same, even when they use similar language. I'm not giving you shit, Robert. I don't care if you go to the gym, dude. Go to the gym. It makes you feel good. But if you're doing it to try to pick up on chicks or to look better in front of people, then consider what you're doing it for. And no amount of structure, symbolism, or progression can change where a path ultimately leads if it begins somewhere else. So to conclude, Freemasonry has now been examined from every angle that I could possibly find that can be grounded in evidence, all of its origins, its structure, its teachings, its symbols, its influence, and the reactions it has produced. And what emerges is not a simple answer, but a clear picture. Freemasonry is not a myth. It's not an invention of rumor or imagination. It is a real structured system that developed over time from operative guilds into a symbolic fraternity. It teaches morality through allegory, forms individuals through ritual and discipline, and connects men through a shared framework that does not require agreement on doctrine. It has existed alongside major moments in history. This is true. It has included men in positions of influence. It has contributed to community building and at times reflected the divisions of the societies in which it operates. It really has. It is neither invisible nor all-controlling. It is present, structured, and complex. And at the same time, the reaction to Freemasonry has also been real. Questions about secrecy, loyalty, and spiritual alignment have been raised for generations. And some of these questions are grounded in observable features of the system. Yes, some of the lodges have been corrupt in some satanic form or another. Others have expanded beyond what can be consistently verified. And both the systems and the reaction to it have shaped how it is understood today. But after all, the layers are separated after history is distinguished from legend, influence from speculation, structure from assumption. The examination tonight comes down to something much simpler. Not what Freemasonry is called, not what its members intend, and not what its critics claim, but what it ultimately points to. Freemasonry just presents a path. It's just a path. It's a path of progression, a path of symbolic understanding, and a path where light is pursued through growth, discipline, and interpretation. But it does not define that light in absolute terms. It allows the individual to approach it, to understand it gradually, to move toward it within the framework it provides. Well, Christianity presents something extremely different. Not a path toward light, but a declaration that light has already come. Not a system to uncover truth, but a truth that has been revealed. Not a process that builds the foundation step by step, but the foundation that is given, upon which everything else must stand. These two approaches can exist side by side in language, but they do not rest on the same starting point. One begins with the individual moving upward, the other begins with the truth coming downward. Well, and because the starting point are different, the direction is different. Freemasonry does not require a man to reject Jesus, but it does not establish Christ as a necessary center of its system or beliefs. It allows belief to remain personal, undefined within the structure, while continuing to shape how truth is pursued. And that is where this distinction becomes clear. This is not about labeling Freemasonry as something it does not claim to be. It is not about forcing conclusions beyond what can be supported. It is about recognizing that a system can be structured, meaningful, and influential, and still operate on a foundation that is different from the one revealed in Scripture. And that difference matters. Because when the source is different, the path will lead somewhere different, even if it appears similar along the way. So the conclusion is not built on fear, it's built on clarity. Right? Built on clarity. Freemasonry is a pattern that forms men through symbols, structure, and progression towards light. Christianity is a revelation that calls men to receive the light already given through Christ. So the question is not whether one appears disciplined, meaningful, or influential. The question is whether the foundation is the same. Because in the end, it is not the language used, the structure followed, or the progress made that determines where a path leads. It is where that path begins and stands at its center. This has been Cause Before Symptom. God bless.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.